Hi everyone. I'm dropping some links in the chat so you can follow along. They're the links to the slides and then a resource document. We have a lot of links, so I didn't want to jump into the chat too much. So I want to say hi. I'm Jessica Dye. I'm a resident librarian at West Virginia University. My co-presenter is Lindsay Inge Carpenter, pedagogy librarian at the University of Maryland, College Park. And before I go farther, I should say that I have a hard time speaking today, so I'm so sorry. We've shared our Twitter handles here, so please feel free to tweet at us or use the hashtag OER Labor to continue the conversation that we're really trying to start here. Lindsay and I met about a year and a half ago at the Open Education Network Certificate for OER Librarianship program. We realized that we had a lot of shared interest and questions about intersectional feminism, power and oppression, and the impact of the two on how we do our work as OER practitioners, especially as librarians whose job duties include but do not solely focus on OER. We ended up writing an article called Bad Feminist Librarians, which this presentation really builds on. We didn't want our work to exist in isolation, and so we wanted to bring the conversation to open ed and connect with other OER practitioners, especially since there's so many gaps that we don't know, like there's so many things we don't know, so we wanted to talk to everyone else. I've dropped the document to our resource document link in the chat, and so you can kind of reference that throughout. Since we only have 25 minutes together, we've made some adjustments. When we realized we really didn't have enough time to talk about everything we wanted to talk about in the way we wanted to talk about it. Specifically, we took out the breakout room so you don't have to get into a random breakout room and be really awkward with people. Maybe that's just me, but that's what I do. We also won't be explicitly addressing our second learning outcome. We just don't have the time, but we've included that in the resource document so you can kind of do some self-reflection there or community reflection there. We really hope that the conversation we're starting here today, this is not new. We're not the only ones starting this conversation, but the conversation that we're having today can really extend out of our time together. And so we're interested in that as well. If you'll do the next slide, Lindsay. So first, we'll start with the learning outcomes to anchor this presentation, give an overview of the current landscape as we see it, so you can understand what we're talking about. We're going to contextualize the relevant concepts because we realized, wow, we have a lot of words. They're just like meaty words, right? And then we'll engage in some collaborative work. It's not going to be as in-depth as we probably want it to be, but it's there. And then we'll end up kind of figuring out what our next steps are. We will be using progressive stacking in this session. Oftentimes when we're in shared spaces, people who speak first, people who are the loudest, and people who belong to majority social groups tend to dominate and shape the conversation. We've chosen to use this equity-driven approach given the fact that we're especially cognizant of power and how it impacts who feels empowered to speak and share ideas. So if you identify as a member of a minoritized social group, however you identify, we're not going to identify you for you. Please add an asterisk to your comment or question in the chat, and we'll do our best to elevate those. It's my first time kind of monitoring progressive stacking, so I'm probably going to mess up. If you see me messing up in a really bad way, let me know and I will course correct. So the next slide. These are our learning outcomes. And so first we'll apply tenets of feminist theory to a discussion of power imbalances in OER labor. And then the second one you will kind of work on in the doc, but critique the applicability of feminist theory to power imbalances in OER labor, and then collaboratively develop action items for applying theory to practice in combating this power imbalances. We realize that a lot of things we're talking about is theory-based, but we want to make them actionable. And so if we'll go to the next slide. We've dropped our presentation summary from Sketch here. Hopefully you read it and this is drew you in to this presentation. I'm not going to read the entire paragraph because there's a lot of words and I can't speak words today, but we've highlighted some of the major concepts. Since many people are actively learning and talking about systems of oppression, social justice, we won't be giving definitions per se, but we will contextualize what we mean when we talk about certain concepts. First, Lindsay's going to walk us through what we mean when we say OER labor. Then I'll talk about power and oppression, and then Lindsay will contextualize feminist theory and intersectionality before we kind of group together again.
Sorry, y'all. My slides are being weird. Okay. Can everyone see OER labor? Can I get a thumbs up if folks can see this one? Excellent. So as Jessica mentioned, we first met at the Open Education Network's OER Librarianship Certificate Training Program. As OER librarians, we were interested in conversations not just about the tools used to produce OER, but about who was actually doing the work to lead OER initiatives and the challenges that they faced. As we continued these conversations, we found ourselves interested in two questions when it comes to OER labor. Who does the work and what work counts? We'll use those two questions to frame the focus of this session, although we recognize that there are many other avenues of inquiry to guide a study of OER labor. We will also refer to those doing OER work as OER practitioners, recognizing that titles for these types of positions vary across institutions. We're both librarians, and the examples we'll use in this presentation probably best represent that work environment. We think that the challenges we faced are likely common among OER practitioners both in and outside of the library, but if we're missing something or say something that doesn't represent your experiences, we want you to let us know either in the chat or in that shared document that Jessica shared earlier. By who does the work, we're thinking about both the identity of the practitioner as well as their employment status and workplace environment. Because of our interest in critical theories, we were first and foremost interested in how the practitioner's race and gender impacted their experiences, particularly in regards to how their work is valued and compensated. Based on our own experiences and those of our colleagues, we also became interested in how OER labor is distributed and compensated. We're particularly interested in how contingent labor supports OER initiatives. So for example, are OER practitioners hired as permanent employees, or are they in temporary positions that don't afford the same security and benefits? For both contingent and permanent positions, what percentage of the practitioner's time is expected to be spent on OER work? Is it their primary focus, or is it something that's added on top of other responsibilities? Finally, we wondered, are OER practitioners expected to be the sole person at their institution managing an OER initiative, or are there resources to hire multiple team members? By what work counts, we're referring to how the work of OER practitioners is valued at their institution and in the field. We've noticed an emphasis on product over process, where quantitative data about the number of OERs produced is valued over the process involved in creating that product. In particular, we believe that the relational labor involved in OER work is greatly undervalued. OER practitioners know that so much of our work is relationship and community building, and this work takes tremendous amounts of time and energy, but it's often invisible. Think about annual reporting. Does your annual report capture those countless moments at campus committee meetings or those brief interactions in the hallways where you're advocating for OER? Or does it just report the number of adoptions or workshops without reflecting the labor that made those products possible? While there are many areas of OER labor that troubled us, we were particularly interested in this devaluing of relational labor. So we'll focus the rest of our presentation on this one aspect. To help us understand how relational labor in OER is devalued and who is responsible for this devaluing, we first turn to a discussion of power and oppression.
Muting is important. So now that Lindsay has explained what we mean when we talk about OER labor, we need to understand some of the mechanisms that have influenced who does the work and how that work is valued. So power really is understood in many different ways, but we've rooted our understanding in critical race theory and feminist pedagogy. Using dismantling racism's definition, we can understand power as something that's both social and institutional. And so you can ask yourself questions: who has access to resources? Who has access to or who has the ability to influence others, network, social capital, access decision makers to get what they want done or actually make the decisions themselves, or even have the ability to define reality for yourself and for others. I'm fascinated by the ability of those in power to shape the reality of others, especially. I have a very personal example, but I am an Asian American woman. I grew up with a model minority myth, which I didn't create or define or like see any value in, but it doesn't mean that I'm completely separated from that, because my reality is influenced by the fact that other people believe in the model minority myth, and that comes out through our interactions together. And so though the model minority myth is extremely harmful in many ways, it's specifically harmful in its conceptualization that Asians and Asian Americans are competing with other racial and ethnic groups for scarce resources. That's where oppression really comes into play. The model minority myth is rooted in oppression as it works to distract people from the fact that there is structural inequity in which white, cisgender, able-bodied men generally have access to more social, economic, and political benefits than those that don't share those social identities. And that's really not to say that if you have like one or all of those social identities, you're a terrible person, or yeah, that you're a terrible person. I don't believe that at all. I'm an able-bodied cisgender person, and I experiences the privileges of being able-bodied and cisgendered. But it's really the fact that I recognize that I have a role in shaping reality for myself and others because of those privileges, because of that power. And so oppression is really systemic when it's built into our society, into our institutions, and that really influences our interpersonal and relational relationships, really what we're talking about, relational labor. So I firmly believe that Black, Indigenous, and people of color should be working together in solidarity for collective liberation that's rooted in critical theory and feminist pedagogy. In Shrewsbury's definition of power, it's really much more expansive than how we usually think about power, in that power is shared. It's rooted in participatory democracy. So our processes enable pathways for people to participate. It harnesses creativity and it unleashes potential. And it really isn't about control, domination, or compliance, but it really is expansive. And so when we talk about power and OER, we can ask ourselves specific questions. Who gets access to these resources? Whether it's fully funding OER positions with permanent full-time staff, is it funding OER initiatives? Who influences others and sets the agenda? Like this conference, who's setting this agenda? Those are very salient questions, I think. Who makes the decisions? Is it solely administrators at an institutional level? Administrators and OER practitioners, students? Are people with minoritized social identities making decisions? Are they included? And who gets to define what open education is? This is something I've really liked about being an attendee and presenter at this conference. It's been very community driven, and that's you can see that from the way the process is, everyone's talking and working together. I just really love it. I went off script here, but being community driven, integrating participatory and democratic processes and sharing power is not easy. It's not easy to do. It takes a lot of intention. It takes a lot of effort, labor, and care. And so as we've noted in our current landscape statement, open education is built on values of collaboration, inclusivity, equity, and accessibility. Yet those same values are not consistently reflected in the hiring, management, and support of OER practitioners. Oftentimes, we cling to the idea of open education as a potential pathway to democratize learning for our students. Potential is great, but what is the impact of potential without intention and effort? Open education will never live up to social justice potential if it'll never be the social good that we think it is unless we actively center and integrate anti-racism and anti-oppression in our work. When we don't, we leave room for a lot of passive harm. We need to make the implicit more explicit by talking about power, by talking about oppression, decision making, what is value, what labor is being done, and how that impacts our work as OER practitioners.
Sorry, also figuring out how to unmute whilst presenting. Okay. Because Jessica and I have our epistemological roots in feminist theory, that's where we started our conversation about power, relational labor, and OER. It's probably more accurate to refer to feminist theories, as this is a diverse field of study that continues to evolve through conversations in both academic publications and popular media. While we don't have time for a deep dive into the history of feminist theory, we've included references at the end of this presentation for those who are interested in learning more. We just wanted to highlight here a few key concepts that have guided our thinking. First is feminized labor. We were both struck by Veronica Ariano Douglas's observation that librarianship is feminized but not feminist. Librarianship and education more broadly are feminized fields, meaning that they're dominated, at least in terms of number, by women. And again, at least in lower ranking positions. Administrative positions in librarianship are disproportionately held by men. And although librarianship is numerically dominated by women, that doesn't mean that the profession itself or the individuals within it actually engage in feminist praxis. As Jessica pointed out in the previous slide, just because a field has the potential to contribute to social justice doesn't mean it actually does so in practice. Actual progress requires critical reflection and active centering of anti-racism and anti-oppression in our work. Similarly, we see a gap between what we claim to value in OER and what our actual labor practices suggest. The concept of feminized labor helps us to examine where some of the gaps are between these stated values and our actual practice. As we write in our article, quote, feminized labor is work that is coded as traditionally feminine, namely labor that is affective, emotional, and relational. Feminized labor is frequently invisible and undervalued in the workplace, particularly when it is performed by women. The relational labor of OER, building relationships with faculty, campus administrators, bookstores, students, all of this falls within this category. And when it's done well, relational labor really reflects some of the best aspirations of OER. It's collaborative and it builds community. Yet, as our colleagues at Rebus Community discuss, this labor is often invisible. We argue that this is because it is a form of care work, traditionally coded as feminine, and therefore viewed as less than within the academy. This invisibility and devaluing is exacerbated when the OER practitioner doing the work holds a minoritized identity. And this brings us to the concept of intersectionality. It's important to acknowledge that first and second wave feminism centered the experiences of middle to upper class white women. These same experiences continue to be centered in librarianship, which is yet another example of how our stated values don't match our actual practice. Black feminist thought, therefore, is essential to understanding how race and white supremacy factor into discussions of feminized labor. You've likely heard of intersectionality. It's become popular not just in academic circles, but also in popular media. Well, on the one hand, it's awesome that such an important concept has a wide audience. Over the years, intersectionality has been appropriated and reduced to a buzzword in some cases. So let's review the origins of the concept to remind ourselves of its power in its undiluted form. The term intersectionality was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, a legal scholar, in 1989, to describe her analysis of court cases where Black women were essentially told they had to separate their identities as women and as Black in order to proceed with employment lawsuits. These plaintiffs, and Crenshaw, argued that what the courts failed to realize was that it was the very intersection of these identities, the combination of being both Black and a woman, that made them particularly vulnerable to systemic oppression. Crenshaw articulated how Black women occupy a space and face discrimination that is distinct from that occupied by and faced by Black men or by white women. In the years since Crenshaw's article, scholars have debated how intersectionality should be applied. Some scholars argue that it should only be applied to understanding the experiences of Black women, and to do otherwise is to remove it from its original context and essentially whitewash the concept. Other scholars have found it to be a useful framework for understanding that, quote, there is a unique experience at the intersection of individuals' identities and efforts to isolate the influence of any one social identity fails to capture how membership in multiple identity groups can affect how people are perceived, are treated, and experience a particular environment. We agree that intersectionality has been appropriated and commodified in ways that go against Crenshaw's original intent. But we also strongly feel that it's important to consider the intersections of identity in order to understand how systems of oppression can multiply marginalize. We want to hear from you. Do you disagree? Do you think that you can add some nuance to our understanding? Help us think through whether intersectionality is the best conceptual tool for this work, or perhaps there's some other framework that can allow us to look at intersections of minoritized identities. In the context of OER labor, we think intersectionality complements and complicates the concept of feminized labor by reminding us that OER practitioners' racial and ethnic identities also impact how their labor is recognized and compensated. And if you didn't have a chance to attend the previous session on opening a space and place for women of color in OER, definitely check out the recording because there's excellent examples in that presentation that are speaking to this very thing. Finally, we think feminist theory is helpful in thinking through how power might be redistributed. My background is in teaching, so I tend to think in terms of feminist pedagogy. In that model, instructors and students are encouraged to consider how authority is constructed. Instructors are encouraged to decenter themselves as the sole authority of the classroom and to instead share power with students. In the context of OER labor, what power do practitioners have? Relative to campus administrators and perhaps our supervisors, we do have limited power. That doesn't mean that we need to passively accept the status quo. We can thoughtfully critique existing power structures interrogating who has institutional power and how they exert and maintain that power. We can also benefit from acknowledging our own role in these power systems, critically reflecting on how our practice maintains or legitimizes oppressive structures. In the process, we recognize our own agency within these systems, opening up opportunities for action to improve not just our own working conditions, but those of our colleagues as well. Although it might seem strange to say that we need to decenter ourselves when we're arguing that our work needs to be more visible, to be better acknowledged and compensated, it all comes back to this. We want to walk the walk. If we say we value democratization of information, collaboration, and anti-oppression work, then we need to engage in a practice that reflects those values. We firmly believe that relational labor is essential to the success of OER initiatives. Part of showing our commitment to that work is making sure we do it in a way that is reflective and consistent with our values.
So we are running out of time. We knew this would happen. We do have it in the Google Docs. So there's a bunch of questions, I think, add your responses. You can add it in there if there's not enough time. But if you do have a question or statement or thought, you can put it in the chat as well. And we'll just give it another minute or so. But before that, I put the question into the chat, and then if Lindsay, you can share the next slide. So what we were thinking about is we really want to make this action oriented. And so we were wondering if there's any interest in like a OER labor CritLib chat. A lot of us are librarians, and so some of us participate in the CritLib chat. So if there's any interest in that, put it in the document or in the chat, and just so we can get a sense if it's worth our time, because our time, our labor is important too. But if you have any other ideas for us to extend this conversation outside of like a Twitter chat or that document, let us know, because we're really interested in making these actionable steps. I know that we didn't really get into like a lot of the nitty gritty, and that's probably because there was just too many concepts and we couldn't pare it down, and I really do apologize for that. And so I didn't really go through and see any comments with an asterisk. Did anyone else? I saw would be very interested in a chat. Yes, that's.
And Jessica, if I can, while you're checking that too, one thing I want to add to plug our article again, we do have a section in there where we talk about action items, but one of the things that we want to think more about is how to take more of a structural approach, because the action items we identified in that article are things that you as a practitioner can do, but it's not tackling these bigger questions about where power is situated in an institution.
Maybe that's our next paper. So we have about a minute. You'll see our references in the resource document and on the slides. Did I skip any asterisk questions or comments?
I don't think you did, but I want to highlight Anastasia's comment if we could, if there aren't any others.
Go for it.
Do you want to read it out loud, or are you okay with me reading it out loud?
I'm sorry, I'm looking at Kristen's comment. Yeah, Kristen's comment. I can read it. I think that when people problematically use the term intersectionality to mean individuality, it's to de-emphasize salient privilege that they have in favor of emphasizing marginalized identities that they also have, while claiming that they didn't hide their privilege because they used the word intersectional. This dilutes Crenshaw's original context of pointing out compounded marginalization. So maybe responsible use of intersectionality can mean emphasizing its use for compounded marginalization, and if it's being used to describe simultaneous oppression and privilege, to be specific about it.
Yes.
So I hate to interrupt, but we're out of time for the session. I'm going to stop recording, but what we can do is if you want to stay informally and chat with people for 15 more minutes, I can leave this Zoom room live.
I'm very informal. I'll hang out for 15 minutes.